Hello everyone, this is Dr. West again. As you heard in the last video, am friends with your instructor, Professor Lynch, and we are former co-workers. And so she has asked me again to help put together this video, given that this was my specialty in graduate school. So today we are going to be continuing our discussion on the biology of behavior. And what we're going to look at in this presentation is a little bit more about the structure of the brain itself. So if you remember, the brain was part of the central nervous system. And what we're going to do is look at some of the specific parts and the specific roles that those parts do. But before we start with that, we're actually going to talk a little bit about how we even know what the brain does and how we've sort of studied it and how we can continue to get an idea of what the brain does. So there are several tools that you can use that we're going to talk about three of them here. So the first is called an electroencephalogram, and it's abbreviated EEG. This is when electrodes are placed onto the scalp to actually measure electrical activity in neurons. It might look kind of crazy if you look at the patient here on the other side of the screen who's got all these little things attached to her head and all these wires and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. But again, none of this is actually invasive. These are merely just electrodes that are placed onto the skin or into the skin underneath the hair on the scalp. And they are simply registering the amount of electrical activity. And if you remember from our last lecture, that electrical activity is occurring when those neurons are sending action potentials down the length of the axon. There's several reasons why this might be done. For example, if someone is having seizure activity, this could help doctors to diagnose what exactly might be going on, where the seizure might be happening, how severe it is. Something else that you might hear about this semester or some other semester is this is how we learned the different stages of sleep. So when someone is asleep, your brain actually goes through very set coordinated patterns of electrical activity during the different phases of sleep. And it was by using this EEG technology we're able to discover that. A second way that we can look at the brain is through a PET scan. PET stands for positron emission tomography. What goes on during a PET scan is this: you are put into a machine that is able to detect radioactive glucose that has been injected into your bloodstream that then travels to the brain. Now, people hear radioactivity and they tend to think it's very, very dangerous. No, this is not a form of radioactivity that is harmful to your body, and it's a very, very small dose, but it's the radioactivity that the machine is able to detect. And the reason they use glucose specifically is that is the number one food for the cells in your brain. The neurons in your brain use lots and lots and lots of glucose when they are active as their form of energy. So what you can do when someone is undergoing a PET scan is you can look at what parts of the brain are the most active by how much of that radioactive glucose they are absorbing into that brain region. So this has given us all kinds of information about which brain regions are active during certain tasks. So you can have people look at pictures, you can have people do memory tasks, you can have people try to express different emotions, you can have all kinds of different tasks that people are doing, and you can see what parts of the brain are responsible and are active during that activity because the neurons take up that glucose. And then the final technique that we are going to talk about is an MRI, which stands for a magnetic resonance imaging. What happens during an MRI is that there's a big machine, again, that you're put into, and there are these huge magnets that sort of rotate around you. And those magnets create this magnetic field that provides sort of a map of what the brain can look like. It can give you an idea of activity in the brain, but it can also give you just a basic idea of the physical structure. So this is probably the number one thing that is used if someone has had some sort of head trauma or damage, or if they are concerned about the structure of the brain itself. And what I think is very, very cool is that your professor, Professor Lynch, has included an actual MRI scan of her brain that she has had taken recently. You can see this is kind of looking from the top down onto her head, but you can see some of her various brain structures here, as well as her sinus cavities and her nose. So again, you can see that it gives us a very good way to visualize what's happening with the brain, because obviously if the person is still alive, you can't just open up their skull and take a look and see what's going on. So we have to have other ways of seeing what's going on in there, and MRI provides us a very good way of doing that. So the last part of this presentation is going to be talking about some of the brain structures, some of the parts of our brain and what they do. In other words, what jobs they are responsible for. We are going to start with the older brain structures. And by older, I don't mean that you had them first necessarily, although you sort of did developmentally. But what I mean by older brain structures is evolutionarily speaking. Evolutionarily speaking, many organisms that have a brain or a brain-like structure have parts that do sort of these basic functions. So you can imagine that some of these older brain functions, these older brain structures are going to be responsible for functions that are necessary just for basic survival, as that would be the number one thing that most organisms would have to have at a bare minimum. So let's talk through some of these. If you sort of looked at it, these brain regions collectively are called the brain stem, and they start where the spinal cord ends. So somewhere down here, there would be your spinal cord going down into your spine, and you have all these incoming sensory fibers, and you have outgoing motor fibers, and all that stuff running through these brain regions that ultimately would go down into the spinal cord or come up from the spinal cord. If you sort of wanted to know where this is on your own head, you could feel about where it starts, because most everybody, if you feel the back of your head, you have sort of a lump on the back of your head. It's a pretty hard lump on the back of your head that's totally normal. Some people's is a little bit bigger than others. Some people's is a little bit smaller than others. That's actually sort of the base of your skull that you're feeling right there. And that gives you about a good indication of approximately where the brain stem begins. So as we start looking at the structures in the brainstem, there are several that we are going to talk about. Let's start from the spinal cord up. So the first brain structure that we will mention is this part here, and it is called the medulla. This is in charge of things that are very essential for your just being alive. In other words, these are some of those autonomic things that we talked about in the last lecture. In other words, it's controlling your heartbeat and your breathing. This is the part of the brain that will take over for you if you stop consciously breathing, taking in purposeful breaths like so if I stop thinking about wanting to take a breath, I won't stop breathing entirely. My medulla will take back over and make sure that I keep breathing. Same thing with my heartbeat, right? I don't have to consciously tell my heart and the muscles in my heart to beat. The medulla automatically takes care of that for me. Moving a little higher than that, you see sort of a bulby area called the pons. The pons helps to coordinate movements. There's actually going to be a lot of brain regions that are involved with movement, but this is one of them. And it also helps to control sleep. Moving up a little further than that, and sort of the top region of the brainstem is called the thalamus. The thalamus looks like it's almost in exactly the middle of your brain. And what you're going to see is that it's going to be surrounded by the midbrain, which we'll get to in just a second. But the job of the thalamus is to act like a sensory switchboard, which nobody probably even knows what a switchboard is anymore. But long time ago, when you would go to make a phone call, you would pick the phone up off the wall, because yes, it was physically connected to the wall, and you would talk to an operator, and you would say, "Operator, I want to talk to my friend Joe." And the operator would say, "No problem." And she would take the cord that's connected to your house and plug it in to the slot that makes it connect to the cord in Joe's house, and you'd be able to talk to Joe. That's what that sort of means. But again, even if you've never seen that before, don't worry about it. The job here is to help send sensory information to where it is supposed to go. So it will send the sensory information to the proper location. So it will send your visual information to the back of your brain. It will send your auditory information to the side of your brain. so that the proper sensory information goes to the proper location. So the job of the thalamus is sort of to filter that incoming sensory information and send it where it is supposed to go. Now you see there's a little note that said except for smell. Technically, smell will eventually get to the thalamus, but before that, smell is actually going to go through several other brain regions. It's the only one of your senses that does that goes through other brain regions first. But really, a cool side effect of that is that smell gets highly connected to memory. So sometimes you can smell something and it will trigger a memory that you haven't thought of in a while. So think about if you've ever smelled a perfume or smelled cookies or something and it made you think of a person or made you think of a place. That's because the smell went through other places before going through the thalamus. Now, the other thing that I mentioned is that all throughout this, because it came from the spinal cord, you've got incoming sensory information and you've got outgoing motor information. Well, that's part of what you're going to see here. These incoming fibers that are running throughout here, so this dark kind of structure that's running throughout all of these structures is called the reticular formation. And the reticular formation's job is to help bring in and out all that information, but mostly to help control arousal. So it keeps you at the proper level of arousal for whatever activity it is that you're doing. One final structure that we're going to talk about that's part of the brainstem, you can sort of see it on this model of this head here, is this little weird structure that sticks off the back. It is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum literally means little brain, and it looks like it's a separate looking brain-like structure that's just kind of stuck on the back of the brain, which is why scientists named it cerebellum way back when. The job of the cerebellum is to process sensory input, particularly from your eyes and from your inner ear, so sort of about where your balance is. That's why it can help you to coordinate voluntary movements and balance. So without your cerebellum, you can still move and you can still walk, but you won't have the pretty fluid, coordinated, graceful movements that most people have. There's also a couple new things that we've learned that the cerebellum is involved with. We've also known that it's involved with nonverbal learning and memory, particularly something that you'll hear about later called classical conditioning. Some of that happens in the cerebellum. A little bit more about the cerebellum, and this is again another reason why Professor Lynch asked me to talk to you about some of this stuff, is I actually did some research looking at an animal model with a disrupted cerebellum. So when I was in graduate school, this paper came out. And this paper was done by some colleagues of ours over in Israel. And what they were finding is that there was these several groups of families that had what they called a form of leukodystrophy. Now, leukodystrophy is sort of like something like multiple sclerosis. It causes problems in these particular patients with weird movements. They're not able to make pretty movements. And what they found when they scanned these individuals is that their cerebellum, which is this little structure back here, was exceedingly shrunken. In a normal patient, which is what this is a picture of, that cerebellum should fill most of this cavity. And as you can see, look at all this blank space down here. These cerebellum just weren't developed very well. They were damaged. It's almost like they hadn't formed, or if they had formed, that they had shrunken and died off. And again, that was resulting in these symptoms that these patients were experiencing, where they were having movement and motor problems. So what my lab was asked to do, again, because we worked with these individuals over in Israel, is we were asked to create an animal model, so a mouse model, that had the same exact genetic mutation that this family had that was causing this cerebellum problem. So the doctors in Israel had narrowed it down and decided what had caused this problem was a genetic mutation. And that genetic mutation was what was called an FA2H, or fatty acid 2-hydroxylase gene mutation. Now again, you never need to remember any of that. But again, here's what I was asked to do. I was asked to create a mouse model that had this same mutation to see if it would also have a cerebellum disruption. And so I did. So here is the mouse that we created. So as you can see, the mouse that we created was very easy to identify because not only did he have problems with brain structure, he also had this very weird hair pattern where his hair was very dry and brittle and would periodically fall out compared to a normal mouse, as you can see here. Now again, the reason why this was so interesting is not only because it was easy to tell them apart, but what we realized is that this fatty acid 2-hydroxylase, if you remember back to what I told you about the special parts of the neuron, neurons have an axon, and that axon is surrounded by a fatty structure that helps protect it and insulate it called myelin sheath. Well, this particular gene that was messed up is partially responsible for making some of that fat that's in the myelin. So what was happening is that the myelin was getting damaged, and therefore the axon would get damaged, and then the neuron would die. And weirdly enough, it's the same sort of fat that's also found in hair of these mice, which is why their hair would be so brittle, and we would be able to identify them easily. But it wasn't just enough to make this mouse. I had to show that not only did he have a shrunken cerebellum, which he did, but I also had to show that it led to motor problems. So I did something called a rotor-rod experiment. As you can see, I have 2 normal mice here, and I have one guy here who's got the genetic mutation. And you would put them on this rod and they would walk. And what you would do is you would constantly speed it up a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And most animals, most normal, healthy animals that have a cerebellum that's not messed up would have no problem doing this at all. Well, look at what happens to my guys. So look at what happens with these individuals on this rotor-rod activity when they have a disrupted gene mutation that caused problems with their cerebellum. And this is a really slow speed here. Uh-oh, it's gotten a little bit faster. These guys are still doing pretty good. Uh-oh, uh-oh. Oh, not good. So as you can see, even at a fairly slow speed, the mice that had this genetic mutation and had the impaired cerebellum, they just couldn't hang on. They just didn't have the coordination required to stay on the machine and able to do what they needed to do. All right, so again, I looked at these mice and I said, well, maybe it's just because I need more practice. Because if you remember, you know, with the first time you learned to ride a bike, for example, you didn't do well the very first time. You had to practice. And so I said, all right, well, let me give them a little more practice. So I did that same experiment that I just showed you the video of a bunch of different times. And here's what I found. What I found was this. All right, let me read you kind of what we're looking at here. This is how long they were able to stay on the machine. Okay, this is the first trial, the second trial, the third trial. So I gave them basically 3 attempts to learn how to do it. And then this was how fast the machine was going. All right, so 4 was very slow, 8 was pretty slow, 16 is where you saw that my mouse fell off, but there were actually 3 additional speeds beyond that. The red, all right, is the mice, all right, that have the disrupted gene, that have the gene mutation. So that's this guy. The black is the normal mouse that doesn't have the messed up cerebellum. And as you can see on the first day, even everybody didn't do very well towards the end as it got really fast. But look at what happens on day 2 and day 3, that even at this super fast speed where they are running to stay onto the rotating bar, the guys that don't have a messed up cerebellum are doing just fine. They're able to run on there for almost 3 to 4 minutes without falling off. And most of the time they didn't actually fall off. They would just jump off because they'd get bored and tired of running on that bar. But look at what happens to these guys. The ones that have the messed up cerebellum, they never really get better. And that's because they can't. They need that cerebellum intact to have learned how to do this fluid behavior more and more and more. And they just didn't have it because of the messed up cerebellum. So hopefully that will help you remember what the cerebellum does. All right, so next we're moving out of the hindbrain and into what we call the midbrain. And there's several midbrain structures that function together in a system, and we call that system the limbic system. This is in the middle part of the brain. It's in between the oldest stuff and the newest stuff. And it's called the limbic system because it's kind of like the word limbo, where you're kind of stuck in the middle of all of these functions. And the entire job, if you had to summarize what all of these parts had to do together as a group, is to help you with your emotions and your drives. And by drives, I mean drives to do things like eat, sleep, have sex, help you to remember things. All right, and so there's several key brain regions that we're going to talk about here, and then I'm going to mention this pituitary gland, so I'll come back to that, but I'm going to talk about these three first. The first one that we're going to talk about is this one that's sort of shown in purple here. All right, it's called the amygdala. The job of the amygdala is to help process emotions, particularly really strong emotions like fear and aggression. Right? And so it makes sense that we would need to be able to do that for survival. We need to remember things that are scary. We need to remember if that dog over there might bite me. Why? So that hopefully I can avoid going over by the dog, or I don't have to interact with that dog anymore. And I remember where that dog lived so that I don't get in trouble again. So we need our amygdala to help us process those emotions. But as I just said, we also need to remember it. So I'm going to skip down here to hippocampus. The hippocampus is shown here in this blue structure, and you've got one of these kind of on either side of your brain. Your brain is split into two hemispheres sort of at this point. And the point of your hippocampus is to help you form explicit conscious memories. So for example, I remember that the house at the end of the street is where the scary dog lived. So it makes sense that our ability to form memories like that would be working in conjunction with our emotional state of being. Also, interestingly, as you grow older naturally, your hippocampus will start to shrink in size. Some of the cells will start to die off. In diseases like Alzheimer's disease, there's an exaggerated shrinking of the hippocampus, which is why Alzheimer's disease is noted for memory loss. Now, I also show you this picture down here. I'm not sure if Professor Lynch has talked about this case study yet, but this is patient HM. He's an interesting case study because he was having these horrible, debilitating seizures. And doctors couldn't give, there were no medications that were working. Nothing they could find worked to help this man stop having these seizures. These seizures were so bad and so frequent that he really couldn't do anything. So the doctors finally decided, okay, what we will do is we will go in and we will obliterate, get rid of the part of the brain that's causing these seizures. So they did. They went in and did surgery, and they got rid of the parts of HM's brain that were causing the seizures, and he was able to fully recover. And he basically stopped having seizures. He might have had an occasional one every now and then, but nothing like it was before, so he could almost have a normal life. Except the part of the brain that happened to be triggering the seizures in HM was his hippocampus. So basically, the part of the brain that they took out and they obliterated was HM's hippocampus. So as you might imagine, even though he lived a very healthy and long life, I think he lived almost to 90 years of age, he could no longer form new long-term memories about certain things. So you'll hear probably a little bit more about HM as you get into the chapters where you're talking about memory. But I wanted to go ahead and introduce him here because this was a very, very early on in the sense of discovery of how things work in the brain, medical procedure that was done. But again, they removed his hippocampus. All right, so in the limbic system, we've talked amygdala, we've talked hippocampus, so we have emotional processing, particularly things that are scary. We've also talked about the hippocampus so that we can remember it. And the third brain region right here that's shown sort of in this green blob is called your hypothalamus. Hypothalamus just means located below the thalamus. It actually has nothing else to do with the thalamus. All right? But its job is to help direct body regulation. It's going to help keep you at the right body temperature. If you feel hungry, it's your hypothalamus that's getting the message and alerting you and make you experience that feeling of hunger or a feeling of thirst so that you then hopefully go and do behaviors to relieve the thirst, like drink some water. And the reason it's able to do this is sort of what we were talking about in the last chapter. It's because the endocrine system and the nervous system are best friends. The hypothalamus is part of the nervous system, but it talks constantly with that master gland from the endocrine system called the pituitary gland. So that when something is out of sorts in the body, for example, you don't have enough water or your body's gotten too hot, the hypothalamus will trigger and send signals to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will release the proper hormones in your body to help adjust whatever it is that you needed to adjust. And if something is not right in the body, the pituitary gland will also send messages, not the pituitary gland, but the endocrine system will send messages back to the hypothalamus saying, hey, this is out of balance. We don't have enough salt, or we don't have enough sugar, or we have too much sugar in the blood. And then your hypothalamus will send signals so that your body corrects it. So your hypothalamus is in charge of guiding the endocrine system, sending endocrine system messages to the pituitary gland so that your body stays at the proper level of homeostasis, and for receiving messages from the rest of the body if things are out of sorts. Again, all three of these work together, right, in what we call the limbic system in the middle of the brain, are exceedingly important for keeping you healthy, keeping you alive, and keeping you, for example, human in ways such as keeping memories, experiencing emotions, etc., etc. Last up is the cerebral cortex. So if you were to sort of be able to look right underneath your skull, you would see this weird pink, blobby, lumpy looking substance. That's your cerebral cortex. It surrounds the outside of all those other structures that we were talking about, except the cerebellum. Cerebellum's kind of lumped up underneath there. But the ultimate job of the cerebral cortex is to help you process information, to help you process things that you know from memory with things that are currently happening, to help you make decisions if you want to move, to help you keep up with time, all kinds of things. It's divided into two hemispheres. There's a big ridge that runs right down the middle of your head, all right, and it divides it into two different hemispheres. Each hemisphere can communicate with each other through a series of connecting fibers called the corpus callosum. But each individual hemisphere is also divided into 4 different lobes, and those lobes are responsible for very specific things. So we'll start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe, again, is named that because it's right in the front of your brain. So if you were to touch your forehead, right behind there would be your frontal lobe. It's responsible for helping you do things like speak, plan out the actions that you want to do, initiate muscle movements. It helps you with judgment, with timekeeping. This is why, for example, adolescents and children have trouble regulating their own emotion expression and regulating their time and procrastination, because their frontal lobe is still developing, and it will continue to develop until your early 20s. So your frontal lobe is doing a lot of different things, and it's the prefrontal cortex is doing a bunch of stuff, and then a bunch of motor stuff kind of happens back here. Directly behind that, so sort of the top back of your head, if you were to pat yourself sort of on the top back of your head, that's where your parietal lobe is. Your parietal lobe's big job is to take in sensory information about touch and about where your body is and how your body is being stood up in the proper position. So it's going to take input from all of your skin and everything like that about where you are being touched and what things feel like. So for example, if you walk into a dark room and you put your hand over on the wall and you sort of run your hand up and down the wall until you find the light switch and you click it on, it was that parietal lobe that was analyzing that touch information to help you feel, all right, that light switch so that you could turn it on. The very, very back of the brain, so if you tap yourself on the back of the head, that is called your occipital lobe. It is sometimes also called the visual cortex because that is all that it is doing. The occipital lobe processes your vision. All right, so your eyes will send messages all the way to the back of your brain to be processed by the occipital lobe. And then finally, your temporal lobe. So if you were to rub your temples, which is kind of like the side of your head, almost near your ears, if you're rubbing your temples, that's about where your temporal lobe is. And your temporal lobe's job primarily is to process hearing, which makes sense, right? Because that's where your earlobes are. So that's how you can remember your temporal lobe is about where your ears are, and your temporal lobe processes hearing. Your temporal lobe also processes a couple other things. For example, it can help with language, and it works with some of your other sensory information like your sense of taste. But the real big job that it's doing is processing your hearing information. The last slide that we're going to talk about, I was briefly already mentioning, but I'm going to sort of pull it out and talk about it by itself. So let me go back. I was telling you that at the very back of the frontal lobe, there was some planning as far as purposeful movements go. And I also told you that the parietal lobe handles touch. Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. These next two things, I'm going to sort of take this chunk of the brain right here, and I'm going to talk about it. Because what we have in that specific chunk, all right, so you have this red part that comes from the frontal cortex and this pinkish part that came from the parietal cortex, helps you to process two different things. The red part from the frontal lobe is called the motor cortex, and again, because it helps you initiate voluntary movements. It helps you decide that I need to make a voluntary movement. And it's mapped exactly with this band of cortex from the parietal lobe called the sensory cortex or the somatosensory cortex. And what the somatosensory cortex is doing is processing touch information and body movement information from the parts of the body that just move. So you can see in this really weird picture of a human body here, all right, a lot of motor cortex is designated to parts of the body that have a lot of movement. So you can see why, for example, there's no back here. You don't really move your back, but your thumb has got this huge exaggeration. Your face has this huge exaggeration because you do a lot of different individual complex movements with your fingers, with your thumb, for example, with your leg to help you move, with your tongue. All right, even just speaking right now, I'm having to use my tongue in all kinds of crazy ways to pronounce the words correctly. So again, the bigger the body part that you see here, all right, the more of this motor cortex is designated to helping that body part move. And then the same thing with the sensory cortex, right? If you were to try to find that light switch that I was talking about, you're not going to use your back or you're not going to use your shoulder to find it. You're going to use your hand, because your hand has a ton of information, a ton of brain space dedicated to the feeling. So you have a lot more sense of touch in certain parts of your body, like your hand and your face, than you do other parts of your body. And this makes sense, again, right? Because we use our hands for feeling all the time, to try to feel what something feels like, to feel if it's hot, to feel if it's cold, to feel if it's soft. Also, we need to protect our face. We have a lot of incoming sensory information on our face. We have our eyes, we have our nose, we have our mouth, right? And we have to be careful not to damage any of that. So it makes sense that a lot of touch information would get a lot of brain space so that we are able to take care of if anything even just lightly touches our face. We're going to feel it and we're going to experience it, and we're going to make sure that it's not something that would somehow damage our face, so that we don't have any damage to a lot of these precious sensory organs. So, motor cortex is part of the frontal lobe, maps up almost exactly to the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe, and these two work together to help you either plan movements and then decide how well that movement is going, or to feel something that's happening and then decide, whoa, I need to move that part of my body. So they definitely work together. All right, let me know if you have any questions, or let Professor Lynch know if you have any questions. Hopefully this all made sense, and I will talk to you soon.